On April 28, 1945, Benito Mussolini was executed without a trial. A day later, his body was driven into Milan and hung upside down in a public square, the same city where for years crowds had once saluted him as Il Duce. The man who had ruled Italy for more than 2 decades, who controlled newspapers, police, and parliament, who promised to restore the glory of ancient Rome, now swung lifeless above a gas station roof while thousands gathered below. Some stared in silence, some shouted, some wept, not in grief, but in release. For many Italians, this was not just the death of a dictator. It was the end of humiliation, hunger, bombings, and fear. It was the collapse of a myth that had dominated their lives for 21 years. But the scene in that square did not happen suddenly. It was the final moment of a long unraveling. Just weeks earlier, Mussolini had still been issuing orders in northern Italy. Years earlier, he had stood on balconies promising empire and destiny. Even as cities burned and soldiers surrendered, he insisted victory was still possible. And yet, in the final days of the war, he was hiding in a truck disguised as a German soldier, trying to escape across the border. No speech, no ceremony, no loyal army waiting to defend him. Just a roadside stop, a recognition, and the end of his rule. So how did a man who once seemed untouchable end up executed by his own people? To understand that final moment in Milan, you have to go back to the beginning, to the anger, the ambition, and the promise that first put him in power. Long before he was executed in a quiet village, Benito Mussolini had convinced millions that he was Italy's future. When the First World War ended, Italy was exhausted. Soldiers returned to unemployment. Prices rose. Factories shut down. Strikes spread across cities. Many felt the country had been humiliated, promised victory but delivered instability instead. Mussolini understood that anger. He didn't speak like a cautious politician. He spoke like a man offering certainty, order, strength, pride. In 1922, he organized what became known as the March on Rome. Thousands of black-shirted fascists moved toward the capital, demanding power. The government hesitated. The king, fearing civil war, chose compromise over confrontation. He handed Mussolini control. At first, many Italians approved. Trains ran on schedule. Street violence declined. Public works projects expanded. Mussolini presented himself as decisive, energetic, modern. Newspapers praised him. Schools repeated his slogans. His image filled walls and balconies. He called himself Il Duce, the leader. Over time, opposition disappeared. Political rivals were silenced. Independent media vanished. Elections became formalities. Loyalty was rewarded. Dissent was punished. Italy did not suddenly fall under dictatorship. It slid there, one decision at a time. And for more than 20 years, Mussolini appeared unshakable. A ruler who had turned national frustration into absolute control. But control built on fear and spectacle has limits. And by the late 1930s, Mussolini was no longer satisfied with ruling Italy. He wanted an empire. By the mid-1930s, Mussolini's ambitions had grown far beyond Italy's borders. He didn't just want stability, he wanted glory. In 1935, Italy invaded Ethiopia, one of the few independent nations left in Africa. The campaign was framed as a civilizing mission, a return to Roman greatness. In reality, it was a brutal war meant to prove Italy belonged among the great powers. The League of Nations condemned the invasion. Sanctions were imposed, but they were weak, and Mussolini interpreted that weakness as proof that he could act without real consequence. The victory inflated his confidence. Soon he aligned himself more closely with Adolf Hitler. In 1939, Italy signed the Pact of Steel with Nazi Germany, binding its future to Hitler's expanding war machine. When World War II began, Mussolini hesitated at first. He waited to see which side would dominate. But in June 1940, convinced Germany would win quickly, he declared war on Britain and France. He believed it would be easy. It wasn't. Italian forces struggled in North Africa. Campaigns in Greece stalled and collapsed. German troops had to intervene to prevent total failure. At home, British and American bombers began striking Italian cities. Food grew scarce. Factories slowed. Families waited in long lines for bread. The empire he had promised was becoming a burden, and the myth of Mussolini as an unstoppable leader began to fracture. By 1943, the war was no longer distant. It had reached Italy itself. In July 1943, the illusion finally cracked. Allied forces invaded Sicily with overwhelming strength. Within weeks, the island was collapsing. Italian troops were exhausted, poorly equipped, and demoralized. German commanders no longer hid their frustration with Mussolini's leadership. Inside Italy, bombings intensified. Rome itself was struck from the air. Civilians fled cities. Confidence in the regime evaporated. On July 24th, Mussolini called a meeting of the Fascist Grand Council, the same body that had supported him for more than 2 decades. He expected loyalty. He had ruled without serious opposition for 21 years. But that night was different. One by one, senior fascist leaders spoke against him. They blamed him for military disaster, for economic ruin, for dragging Italy into a war it could not win. When the vote was counted, 19 members supported removing him. Only 7 stood by him. The next day, Mussolini met King Victor Emmanuel III, assuming he would retain authority. Instead, the king calmly informed him that he was dismissed. There was no dramatic confrontation. Guards escorted him out. He was placed under arrest. Across Italy, news spread rapidly. Crowds tore down fascist symbols. Portraits of Il Duce were smashed. For the first time in a generation, people shouted openly in the streets without fear of punishment. After 21 years of rule, Mussolini had been removed in a single night. But his story was not finished. Hitler refused to let him disappear so easily. Adolf Hitler saw Mussolini's removal as a betrayal and a threat. If Italy surrendered fully, Germany's southern flank would collapse. So within weeks, Hitler ordered a daring rescue mission. Mussolini had been moved between secret locations, eventually placed under guard at a remote mountain hotel in Gran Sasso. The location was isolated, difficult to reach, and believed secure. In September 1943, German commandos led by Otto Skorzeny launched a surprise operation. Gliders landed beside the hotel. Italian guards, stunned and outmatched, offered little resistance. Mussolini was freed without a firefight. The operation was celebrated as a bold success. But the reality was different. Hitler did not restore Mussolini to true authority. Instead, he installed him as the head of a new state in northern Italy, the Italian Social Republic, often called the Republic of Salo. It existed in name. German forces controlled the military, the economy, and security. Mussolini issued statements, but decisions were made elsewhere. He was back in office, but he was no longer the one in charge. And by early 1945, even that fragile position was collapsing. By the spring of 1945, the war in Italy was almost over. Allied forces had pushed steadily north through the peninsula. German troops were retreating toward the Alps. Cities that once displayed fascist banners now flew resistance flags. On April 25th, Italian partisans launched a coordinated uprising across northern cities. In Milan, resistance fighters seized control of key buildings. In Turin and Genoa, fascist offices were overrun. German forces began withdrawing in disorder. Mussolini understood what this meant. There would be no negotiated surrender for him, no comfortable exile arranged through diplomacy. On April 25th, he fled Salo with a small group of loyal officials, German soldiers, and his longtime companion, Claretta Petacci. Their plan was simple: reach the Swiss border and disappear. To avoid recognition, Mussolini wore a German military coat and helmet. He sat silently in a truck filled with retreating German troops, hoping to pass unnoticed among the chaos. It was a striking contrast. For years, he had stood on balconies, delivering speeches to massive crowds. Now he avoided eye contact, blending into the back of a convoy. On April 27, near the lakeside village of Dongo, the column was stopped by Italian partisans from the 52nd Garibaldi Brigade. They were inspecting vehicles, searching for escaping fascist leaders. One partisan noticed a man sitting stiffly in the truck, saying nothing. They ordered him out. When the helmet came off, there was no doubt. The dictator who had ruled Italy for 21 years stood before them, pale, silent, and without an army. This time, there would be no rescue mission. Mussolini and Claretta Petacci were taken to a small farmhouse in the village of Giulino di Mezzegra. It was a quiet place. No crowds, no cameras, no grand stage. Inside, partisan leaders debated what should happen next. Some believed he should be handed over to Allied authorities and tried in court. Others argued that delay could create chaos, or even another rescue attempt. The war was ending. Emotions were raw. Years of repression, arrests, and executions weighed heavily on those making the decision. By the morning of April 28th, the choice had been made. Mussolini was led outside and positioned near a stone wall by a gate. There was no speech, no last declaration of defiance. Witnesses later described him as silent, tired, almost detached. Claretta Petacci refused to leave his side. The order was given. Gunfire broke the stillness of the village. It was over in seconds. The man who had once dominated Italy's political life for more than 2 decades was dead. But what happened next ensured the moment would be remembered far beyond that farmhouse. The following day, the bodies of Mussolini, Petacci, and several other fascist officials were transported to Milan. They were taken to Piazzale Loreto, a square that carried its own history. Months earlier, fascist forces had executed resistance fighters there and left their bodies on display as a warning. Now the roles were reversed. Mussolini's body was hung upside down from a metal beam at a gas station roof. Crowds gathered quickly. Thousands came. Some stared, some shouted, some struck the bodies in anger. It was chaotic, emotional, symbolic. For many Italians, it was not just revenge, it was the visible end of fascism. If you value deep, honest breakdowns of the moments that reshape history, make sure you're subscribed, because stories like this don't begin or end where most summaries stop. And even in death, Mussolini's story wasn't finished. Within days of Mussolini's execution, the war in Italy formally ended. On May 2nd, 1945, German forces in the country surrendered. The fighting stopped, but the damage remained. Bombed cities, divided families, shattered institutions. The monarchy that had once empowered Mussolini could not survive the collapse. In 1946, Italians voted in a national referendum to abolish the crown. The country became a republic, beginning a new political chapter after 2 decades of dictatorship. Even in death, Mussolini remained controversial. To prevent his grave from becoming a rallying point for remaining fascists, authorities buried him in secret in an unmarked location near Milan. But in 1946, a small group of loyalists stole his body, hiding it for months before police recovered it. For more than a decade, the government kept his remains concealed. Finally, in 1957, they were returned to his birthplace of Predappio, where his tomb still stands today, visited by historians, tourists, and a small number of supporters who continue to argue over his legacy. But the image that endured was not his tomb. It was that square in Milan, a reminder that power built on fear can appear permanent until suddenly it isn't. And if you're drawn to stories like this, where authority decays, control slips, and history turns in a single moment, subscribe to Power Rot, because this channel exists to examine exactly how power rises and how it falls.